still had compounding labs and wet boards we had to take. A lot of the focus was on the product and the services and compounding. And, it was shifting, right? The winds of change were coming. Pharmacy was changing. This concept of pharmaceutical care was, coming onto the scene. And there's a seminal article written by Hepler and Strand that talked about this in AJHP. And then Penna kind of I think he articulated it a little better in regards to really where pharmacy was going. And that was to be, equal members of the healthcare team and no longer focusing much on the products and services and really focusing on outcomes and quality of life of patients and the impact that pharmacotherapy can make and managing that, really being the expert there, right? So, for us and what was happening for us to get there, however, and to really achieve this vision was, pharmacy had to step its game up, right? We had to enhance our education and training, right? We had to move to an all doctoral program, right? All PharmD to be able to provide that higher level of care. And you see that AACP, implemented this in '92. They said all colleges should go to entry-level doctoral degree. Obviously this place is very progressive, as you all know, has a long history of being at the cutting edge of pharmacy. And it shouldn't come as any surprise that a couple of years later, the first PharmD class was entered here in '95. That happened to be the year I graduated. So, for me, I still had the opportunity to go pro early with the bachelor's of pharmacy and get out and start working. But really, having grown up here, my father being a professor here for 38 years, that really wasn't in the cards. I was going PharmD all the way. I wanted to anyways. I'm a lifelong learner, which we'll get into this. And so for me, that was the path I was going to go down. And a couple of other things that were happening that influenced my career is this concept of pharmacoeconomics. Now, you guys are familiar today with the Institute of Pharmaceutical Outcomes and Policy here, the IPOP group. But back then in the early '90s, this was an emerging area of pharmacy. And you can see on the slide here, there weren't many schools that actually had formal graduate programs in pharmacoeconomics. And many of them came out of the old pharmacy administration programs. And places like South Carolina and Arizona and Colorado tend to be on the forefront, at least from what I recall back in those days. But this was changing, and really in the early '90s, not much has changed to now, right? It was all about high drug pricing and unsustainable costs in healthcare. How are we going to afford it, right? Bill Clinton was president. Hillary was going to try to change it. Didn't quite work out that way. And 30 years later, we're still talking about the same things about unsustainability of healthcare costs, high drug prices, and it's 15% of GDP now, maybe it's 20 or whatever. But the reality is we're still talking about the same things. And the idea is now about value, right? Companies got to talk about the value of their products. And this was the discipline that allow us to develop those methodologies to demonstrate what is the value of a product or of a healthcare service. It's not just drugs, right? You can do a lot of different things. So this was pretty big for me as I was going through school. And what I wanted to do is maybe talk about what was happening in some of the other areas briefly before I get back to kind of my training and path. But this demonstration of value really was because of the productivity of the large pharmaceutical manufacturers here. I mean, it seemed like when I was in school, like every other month, not only was a new drug coming out, but like a new class of drugs, right? It's like the ACE inhibitors, the ARBs, the SSRIs, PPIs. I could go on and on. I put a couple examples up here for you, but this was the era of the big blockbusters. And how are we going to pay for it? This was the idea behind value and things like that. At the same time, look at CVS. I'm going to use CVS as an example, not to pick on them, but just to illustrate the consolidation and vertical integration that was happening in healthcare. CVS was a small chain in the Northeast with less than 1,000 stores in the 90s. It's hard to believe there weren't CVS's down here, right? But they ended the 90s with over 4,000 stores, and they actually opened the first online pharmacy, right? And we're going to come back to CVS because they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And if you think about from government standpoint, what was happening then? Well, it's interesting, right? The federal government was not a large purchaser of drugs back then. There was no Part D benefit. That would be over a decade away, right? Medicaid happened to be a pretty big payer of drugs. So a lot of the action was there in Medicaid. I talked about over 90 and the impact on pharmacy, but the impact on manufacturers was this was the first time the government had a drug discount pricing program put in place, passed by law, right? That was a Medicaid drug rebate agreement. It requires manufacturers to extend discounts to Medicaid. A couple of years later, there was the VA Healthcare Act that the federal government for the first time established the federal supply schedule and this little thing called the 340B program, which we'll talk about a little bit later in terms of it being a disruptor today in pharmacy. So these were the first programs really where the government intervened to manufacturers and said, hey, you guys got to offer discounts on their drugs. If you want them covered by Medicaid and Medicare, you need to give us discounts or they're not going to be covered, right? So this was really important, right? And this is a lot of what I do today is making sure my company's in compliance with Medicaid drug rebate program, VA, federal supply schedule, all these things that are extremely boring to most people, but I find fascinating. And then on the bottom here, what was happening in biotech? Well, biotech was, at its infancy. Most of the products were really around recombinant technology, creating naturally occurring proteins, hormones, and growth factors, right? Think about it, it's insulin, from purified pork insulin to human insulin. You had growth factors, you had epigen, right? These types of things. But that's where biotech was in its early days. And all these antibody drug conjugates, monoclonal antibodies, cell-based therapies, those were years away. And I'll get to those and how things changed over time. But I wanted to kind of share a little bit of context for you. And one of the things that manufacturers did a lot of back then, particularly my former company, Amgen, was they educated pharmacists quite a bit on these new drugs and, things like how do you store epigen, things like that, proper handling of it, administering it and so forth. It was a whole new era, right? We were used to dealing with pills and a large pharmacy and never, the only time you went in the refrigerator was to get an antibiotic or insulin, something like that, right? So things changed quite a bit. All right, and I want to talk about a couple of big medical breakthroughs that happened and the influence that they had both on the industry and me personally. And one's the protease inhibitors and combination therapy in HIV. So, a couple of things here. You all probably don't know who Magic Johnson is, right? But he was the LeBron James of the era, right? He was the best basketball player there was. He was on the Lakers. It was Showtime. It was amazing, right? In 1991, he shocked not only the basketball world, but the world when he announced he was HIV positive, right? Back then, that was pretty much a death sentence. So for him to be alive 30 years later, not only alive, but leading a very healthy life and having kind of done his second and third act in life now, where he's a very successful entrepreneur, really just shows the ability of the industry in pharmacotherapy to really turn a deadly disease into a chronic disease. That was a big impact scene for me personally, as I'll get to here in just a few minutes. I'll never forget one of my first PharmD rotations. It's actually at Central Baptist and Family Practice. And I'm like, not used to seeing a lot of patients, not very much into patient care, as I'll get